Welcome to the Project Management PrepCast, your guide to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our lesson on validating scope. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In part 2, you saw the overview and inputs for validating your scope. We are continuing here with our discussion of the tools and techniques and outputs, a review, and then we have some PMP exam advice and sample exam questions for you as well at the end. Let's get to it. Here's a quick overview of the tools and techniques of this process. If you remember from part 1, I said our main goal is on validating scope and looking at the scope, and really 2 tools and techniques are sufficient to do that. And the 2 tools and techniques that are sufficient to do that are inspection as well as group decision-making techniques. Need more detail? All right, here we go. As we covered in part 1 of this lesson, we are going to look at our inputs. So on one hand, we have documents that help us understand the expected state of our deliverables. In other words, we have specifications of what it was that we had originally wanted. We have this information captured in the project management plan, the requirements documentation, and the requirements traceability matrix. So we have those in one hand. And in the other hand, we have the inputs that show us the actual state of what it was that we actually delivered. These are the verified deliverables. There's also work performance data, which tells us a bit more about the deliverables themselves, for example, related non-conformities and validations. So, now that you have both hands full with these inputs, the question is, what are you going to do with them? Well, the answer is, of course, you inspect each deliverable to make sure that it complies with the requirements. Inspection is defined in the PMBOK guide as examining or measuring to verify whether an activity, component, product, result, or service conforms to specified requirements. The actions that we associate with inspection include, of course, inspect, where you usually associate a pass or fail for the deliverable on a particular aspect of the deliverable or when providing an overall assessment. Audit, which may mean visiting the site armed with your clipboard and checklist. Examine, which may mean taking the time to take a closer look at the deliverables. And measure, where, if possible, you try to avoid qualitative judgment of the deliverable and base scope validation on the metrics that you agreed on as part of your signed-off requirements. But know that there are many other names for inspection, such as reviews or walkthroughs. It may be called different things in different industries or contexts. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It's the idea that counts, and the idea is that you are going through the process of ensuring that the deliverables meet the requirements and that they meet the acceptance criteria. Let me give you an example of how inspection can work. A few years ago, I watched a television program on how an airplane is built. That was a 2-hour special of a television program from Germany called Die Sendung mit der Maus. It's a children's program, but nevertheless, I learned something about how validate scope works. So, after the airplane had gone through the quality checks and test flights, it was opened up to the customer for validation. The customer's team arrived with a long checklist, and they walked through the complete aircraft and compared each item to the checklist and their original specifications. If they found a problem, they would make a note on their checklist, and then they took out some bright orange sticky tape, and they would tape that sticky tape to the problem area. So let's say there was a problem with the armrest of seat 13B. They would note that on the checklist, but they would also attach sticky tape to the armrest, orange sticky tape, so that the repair crew could easily see all the things things that needed fixing. And that's all there is to inspection. Next, we have the group decision-making techniques, which according to the PMBOK guide are techniques to assess multiple alternatives that will be used to generate, classify, and prioritize product requirements. Group decision-making techniques, they can be used to reach a conclusion as it relates to scope validation. The group can involve the project team and the stakeholders. We looked at group decision-making techniques in previous lessons, so we're not going to talk about these here in detail, but the project team and the stakeholders, they can use unanimity, majority, plurality, and dictatorship or other group decision techniques in coming to a decision in terms of validating completed project deliverables. And if you think about this process logically, well, there can only be two outcomes. The deliverables are either okay or they are not okay. There's nothing in between. So you might say, well, there should only be two outputs to this process, but the PMBOK guide manages to have four, and you'll see why in just a moment. So these four outputs are the accepted deliverables, change requests, work performance information, as well as project documents updates. The primary output of the validate scope process are, of course, your accepted deliverables. As was the case in the airplane inspection, you will very likely have some process defined in the scope management plan that indicates how acceptance and non-acceptance should be documented. Usually, if there's a non-acceptance, you need to have an explanation or reason for non-acceptance. All of this information and any other supporting documents make up this first output of accepted deliverables. Let's say that the deliverables are not accepted. The customer thinks that there is something wrong. That's where change requests, our second output, comes in. Let's go back to my example of inspection and that bright orange sticky tape that they use to tag defects on the airplane. Have you ever flown in an airplane with pieces of orange sticky tape still attached to it? Probably not, because each of these pieces of sticky tape represents a change request for defect repair. And guess what we do with these change requests? Well, we hand them off to the Perform Integrated Change Control process for review and disposition. This may not result in a change, update, or defect of a repair. The review and disposition process may uncover the fact that there is really nothing wrong. For example, if the change requests were about having the wrong shade of blue on the carpet on the airplane, where the customer requests that it be replaced, if it's then determined that the inspector simply made a visual error and in fact the carpet has the correct shade, well, there is no need to change the carpet. Next, we have work performance information as an output. This information organizes the performance data gathered as we are validating our scope. And this can include information on project progress, such as deliverables that have been started, deliverables that have been completed, and of course, deliverables that have been accepted by the customer. This information is disseminated and handed over to stakeholders as it is prescribed by our project's communications management plan. As you have heard throughout the discussion, there is a lot of documentation that is happening as you are validating the scope. Just think of the checklists that you create. So it's obvious that updates to our project documents is also an output. Which documents require updating depends completely on your project and company policies. You may have a requirement to send a formal validation status report. There may be formal approvals, perhaps signatures or sign-offs or a signed letter of acceptance from the customer that are required, or your WBS dictionary may have to be updated to reflect acceptance or non-acceptance by the customer for each of your work packages. Let's review. First, validate scope is the process of formalizing acceptance of the project scope by the stakeholders. It requires verifying deliverables and results to ensure that all were completed correctly and satisfactorily. We discussed the timing of validate scope, how it occurs at the end of each project phase and at the end of the project itself. It follows control quality, but may occur in parallel with control quality on some project. Should a project get cancelled or terminated before it has completed, then you still have to validate your scope to document the level and extent of the completeness. We discussed the use of inputs and tools and techniques to create different outputs. In one hand, we hold the inputs that establish expectations for our deliverables. In the other hand, we hold the inputs that show us what was actually delivered. You inspect and use group decision-making techniques to determine acceptance or non-acceptance. This results in either accepted deliverables or change requests. Work performance information and project documents updates are also consequences of this process. Before we end this lesson, let's go through some things you need to focus on when reviewing the validate scope process for the exam. We've already covered this in the process overview and the review for this lesson, but you should know some key facts about validate scope for the PMP exam. You need to know what are the important characteristics of validate scope. For example, validate scope involves any of the following: sign-off, review, inspection, documenting completed deliverables, and also ensuring that the deliverables conform to the requirements which were originally defined quite early on during your project. And then you should know the answer to these two questions here. Question 1, when should you perform validate scope? And the answer here is that we do this at the end of each phase of the project. Question 2, why is scope verified at the end of each phase of the project? The answer here is because you hand over the deliverables at the end of each phase. They need to be inspected by the customer. And by the way, don't forget that every project is different, because you might be handing over your deliverables not just at the end of each phase. So the answer to question 1 could actually be not just at the end of each phase of the project, but upon delivery of the product, service, or result. So when should you perform validate scope? Upon delivery, because sometimes you may be delivering parts of your product not at the end of the phase, but whenever they are ready. It can be fluid because no project is alike, but this here is the standard. I have 3 more questions for you. 2 of them are more study focused, and then the third one is an actual exam sample question. So, first of all, what do you do if you do not receive a formal sign-off from your customer? Think back to the example that I gave you. What did I do there? I followed the defined process in our project. For example, you should escalate the issue to management, but it's more important to know that you follow the defined process. Second, you could find a scenario-based question like this. You're close to the end of phase 3 of your project. On which process should you now concentrate your efforts? Well, the answer would of course be, obviously, you now focus on validating your scope. And finally, here is the promised PMP exam sample question. Jean is managing a web design project. During the validate scope process, the client's manager rejects all deliverables. Jean thinks that these deliverables actually conform to what was agreed upon, and she feels that the client's manager is not being fair. So, what is Jean's best option? Should she A. refer to the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, B, refer to the project charter signed by the project sponsor? Or should she C, refer to the scope statement prepared by the project team? Or D, refer to the requirements documentation approved by the customer? Take a few moments to review these four and make your decision. The correct answer is, of course, that she should D, refer to the requirements documentation approved by the customer. Remember, Jean said that she thinks that these deliverables conform to what was agreed upon, so she wants to go back to the document where it is described what they actually should be. The requirements documentation will tell you how the customer requirements relate to the business needs, what kind of quality requirements the stakeholders had, and a dozen more similar aspects in regards to the requirements for the project and product. They also contain the acceptance criteria, which you should refer to when the customer is validating the scope. And this concludes our look at the validate scope process. So it's time for Justine to say,
I've got to be going.
And I say, until next time.